The door was locked. The security cameras were working. Yet, by morning, the millionaire inside was gone, vanished without a trace. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Just an empty mansion and a single clue left behind. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night at the Blackwood estate. The mansion, perched on a secluded hill, was home to billionaire investor Richard Langford. A man of power, influence, and secrets. That night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., security cameras captured Richard entering his bedroom. The doors locked automatically, an advanced system, fingerprint access only. Outside, guards patrolled the estate, and every inch of the mansion was covered by state-of-the-art surveillance. No one could get in. No one could get out. Yet, by morning, Richard Langford was gone. His bed was untouched. The doors were still locked. The security cameras showed nothing unusual. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbances. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The only clue? A single glass of red wine, spilled on the marble floor. The moment Richard Langford's disappearance was reported, detectives swarmed the estate. Every security guard was questioned, every inch of the mansion combed through. Yet, nothing made sense. His phone, wallet, and watch were still on the bedside table. His security system logs showed no breaches. The cameras recorded no one entering or leaving. But the strangest detail? The spilled wine. Forensics analyzed it, laced with a sedative. Someone had drugged him. But how? The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were sealed shut. Then, they found something even more chilling. A faint set of bare footprints, leading from the wine glass to the wall. But they stopped there. As if Richard Langford had walked straight into solid stone, and disappeared. The detectives refused to believe a man could vanish into thin air. They examined the wall where the footprints ended, knocking against the surface. Hollow. A deeper investigation revealed a hidden latch behind a bookshelf. With a slow creak, the wall shifted, revealing a dark passageway leading underground. The air inside was damp and suffocating. Dust particles floated in the dim glow of their flashlights as they descended a narrow stone staircase. At the bottom, they found a door, old, rusted, and slightly ajar. Inside was a small, windowless room, and a chair. Straps dangled from its arms, the seat slightly indented, as if someone had been there recently. The walls were lined with photos of Richard Langford. But they weren't just ordinary photos, they documented his every move, his meetings, his private moments. Someone had been watching him. And they had taken him. The detectives exchanged tense glances. Who had been watching Richard Langford? And why? As they searched the underground room, they noticed a small table covered in newspaper clippings, all about Langford's career, his rise in business, and his controversial dealings. Some headlines were circled in red ink. Real estate mogul accused of fraud. Langford's competitors mysteriously disappear. The untold secrets of Richard Langford, their stomachs churned. This wasn't just a kidnapping, this was personal. Suddenly, a rustling sound echoed from the passageway behind them. They weren't alone. Detective Harris signaled to his partner to stay quiet. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a shadow moved. A figure in a dark hood stood at the top of the stairs, watching them. Without hesitation, the detectives reached for their weapons. But before they could react, the lights cut out. A sharp click. And the sound of the door locking behind them. The room plunged into pitch-black darkness. Detective Harris's pulse pounded in his ears. "Stay close," he whispered to his partner. A metallic clank echoed through the underground chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone breathing nearby. Then, a voice. Low, distorted. You shouldn't have come here. Harris swung his flashlight toward the sound, but nothing was there. Just cold, empty space. Then, suddenly, bang. A deafening gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the wall, missing them by inches. Get down! Harris shouted, pulling his partner to cover behind an old desk. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief second, they saw him. A man, masked, standing in the doorway. Gun in hand. But he wasn't aiming at them. He was aiming at someone else. Another presence lurked in the darkness. And whoever they were watching too. Harris tightened his grip on his gun. The masked man stood frozen, his weapon pointed not at them, but at the darkness beyond. Then, a whisper. Low, raspy. Coming from the shadows. You think you're in control? The air turned ice cold. A faint shuffle echoed in the room. Someone else was here. Watching. Waiting. The masked man's hands trembled. I did what you asked, he muttered. I got rid of them. I did everything you wanted. Harris exchanged a glance with his partner. Who was he talking to? Then, without warning, the masked man turned his gun on himself. A single gunshot rang out. Blood splattered the cold floor. His body collapsed. Motionless. Silence. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a crime scene. This was something much, much deeper. And whoever was pulling the strings was still out there. Detective Roberts carefully approached the body, his breath shallow. As he knelt down to inspect, the rain began to pour harder, making the scene feel even more suffocating. The body was cold, its eyes wide open in shock, but there was something strange, something that didn't fit. The victim's hand was tightly clenched around a crumpled piece of paper. Roberts pried the paper out of the hand, his fingers trembling. Unfolding it, he discovered a cryptic message scrawled in dark ink. The game's not over, detective. You're just a pawn. His mind raced. This was no ordinary crime. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Roberts was the target. He could feel the walls closing in. Was the killer watching him right now? Was this all part of a twisted plan that he had yet to understand? In the distance, a faint sound echoed, footsteps, quick and deliberate. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was here, and it wasn't over yet. Roberts got to his feet, his gun at the ready. He scanned the dark alley, his senses on high alert. His pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't let this game end. Not until he had answers. The shadows seemed to shift around him, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, a voice whispered from behind him. You should have stayed out of this, detective. The game was just beginning. The voice sent a chill down Detective Roberts' spine. He turned quickly, his gun aimed at the figure emerging from the shadows, but no one was there. The alley remained eerily silent, save for the distant hum of city traffic. His breath came out in shallow gasps as his mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The cryptic message, the strange circumstances surrounding the case, everything pointed to one thing: he was being toyed with. But who was behind it all? Was this some sick game for a killer, or something more sinister? He stepped forward, his eyes scanning every corner of the alley, every shadow, but there was no sign of the person who had spoken. The heavy rain blurred his vision, making the world feel distorted, like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. He lowered his weapon, his shoulders tense, ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, a cold, metallic sound echoed from behind him. It was a brief flash of light as something sharp gleamed. Roberts spun around, but it was too late. A figure lunged at him from the shadows, knocking him to the ground. A struggle ensued, but Roberts was no match for the attacker's strength. With one final push, the killer left him gasping for air, retreating into the dark abyss of the alley. Roberts' vision blurred, his hands still clutching the crumpled note as his last breath escaped his lips. The game was over. But for Detective Roberts, the end was only the beginning. Detective Roberts' lifeless body lay sprawled on the cold, wet pavement, the final traces of life leaving his eyes as the rain washed over him. Yet, the city seemed indifferent. The world continued, unaware of the horror that had unfolded in that desolate alleyway. The killer's footprints faded quickly into the night, swallowed by the relentless rain. But something about this case lingered. Roberts was one of the sharpest detectives on the force, known for his unflinching determination and keen instincts. He was meticulous, always one step ahead. And now, he was dead. It didn't make sense. Whoever did this had to know him, had to know what made him tick, his every move, his vulnerabilities. As the investigation team arrived at the scene, the focus shifted to gathering evidence and piecing together the puzzle. They found the crumpled note in Robert's hand, its message cryptic and unsettling. The game has just begun. You were never meant to win. Forensics couldn't find a trace of the killer's DNA or fingerprints. No sign of a weapon. No obvious motive. Only the unsettling feeling that the killer had known exactly how to strike, how to leave behind just enough to taunt but not enough to give away their identity. The following days were filled with confusion and whispers. The case remained open, but no real leads emerged. Officers scoured every inch of the city, hoping for a break. Yet, each search only led to more dead ends. The killer was a ghost, silent, elusive, and careful. Then, one evening, as the case appeared to be drifting toward a cold conclusion, a new piece of evidence surfaced, almost by accident. A local bartender, a regular at the corner bar where Roberts had often gone after a long day, reported something strange. The bartender recalled an unfamiliar man entering the bar the night before Roberts was found dead, his demeanor unsettling, his presence too precise, too knowing. The bartender had noticed him because he didn't quite blend in with the usual crowd. This man sat alone, scribbling something on a napkin. When he left, the bartender had found the napkin crumpled up under the table. On it was a phone number. The number seemed innocuous at first, until further investigation revealed it was connected to a burner phone, purchased just hours before the murder. Whoever had written that number on the napkin had been preparing something, orchestrating a plan long before Robert's death. Detective Jane Foster, the lead investigator on the case now, took it upon herself to follow this new lead. Her gut told her they were closing in on something. She tracked the number to a small, unassuming apartment on the outskirts of town. As she approached, she could feel the weight of the case closing in around her. She knocked on the door, her hand trembling as she did so, despite years of experience in law enforcement. The door creaked open slowly, and inside, the air felt thick with tension. It was then that she saw him, standing in the dim light of the apartment, smiling. The same smile that had been described by the bartender, cold and calculating. It was the killer, but he wasn't running. He was waiting. "Detective Foster," he said calmly, his voice smooth like he was addressing an old friend. "I was wondering when you'd come." He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. But Foster didn't need to step inside. She already knew. The entire room was lined with photographs of Roberts, taken from hidden angles, from the shadows. It was clear that this man had been watching him, studying him for weeks, maybe even months. And there, in the center of it all, was a photo of her. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just chasing a killer, she was being hunted. The game wasn't over, it had only just begun for her. With a single, swift motion, the man reached for something under the table. A gun. Foster's instincts kicked in, and she drew her weapon, aiming it at him. But before she could pull the trigger, the room plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed as the man disappeared into the shadows, vanishing once more. And in that moment, Foster understood the truth. The killer wasn't just a criminal. He was playing a game, an elaborate, terrifying game. And he wasn't going to stop until he had trapped her, too. The case was no longer about justice, it was about survival. Detective Jane Foster's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness swallowed her whole. She instinctively kept her weapon aimed in the direction where the man had disappeared, but she knew the reality. The room was empty. Her breath was the only sound, shallow and ragged in the silence that followed. The gunshot had never come. She was alive for now, but that didn't make her feel safe. Every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't over. The man in the apartment had made it clear, he wasn't just playing a game. He was making her a part of his twisted puzzle. And now, more than ever, she understood the stakes. As she stood there in the pitch-black room, her mind raced. She had no choice but to call for backup, to bring in the full force of the department. But even as she made the call, she couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was always one step ahead. Minutes later, the lights flickered back on, revealing the apartment in its eerily quiet state. Everything seemed ordinary, yet it wasn't. Foster slowly moved through the room, her senses heightened, scanning every inch of the space for any sign of movement. The photographs of Detective Roberts were everywhere, each one telling a story of observation, of patience, of a man who had known everything about his victim before pulling the trigger. But now, one photograph caught her eye. It wasn't of Roberts. It was of her, from a day she remembered all too well. It was a photo taken from a distance, the shot so perfectly timed that it made her blood run cold. It was taken just hours before she'd entered the apartment. Foster's mind raced with the implications. He had been watching her long before she realized. He had been pulling strings, playing her, making her the next part of his deadly plan. Determined to end this, Foster left the apartment, alert and on edge, waiting for any sign of danger. Her phone buzzed, an incoming message. "You're getting closer, Detective. Too close. But don't worry. I'll make sure you never make it out of this game alive." Her blood ran cold. She wasn't just chasing a killer anymore. She was being hunted, stalked, and toyed with. Every step she took was a move in his twisted game of cat and mouse. The pressure was suffocating. But she couldn't back down now. Not after everything that had happened. She had lost Roberts, but she wouldn't lose herself. Over the next few days, Foster's life became a blur of surveillance, false leads, and sleepless nights. She knew the killer was always watching, always waiting. Each phone call, each mysterious message, each encounter with a seemingly innocent stranger felt like another move in a game that she couldn't escape. Her one ally in this was Detective Mark Daniels, who had been working the case with her from the start. But even he was starting to feel the weight of the mystery. Foster and Daniels had tried everything, looking for connections, cross-referencing information, running down every lead, but every time they thought they were close to cracking the case, the killer would slip through their fingers like smoke. The killer had grown bold. His attacks weren't just physical anymore. He was playing with their minds. Psychological games, cryptic messages, and threats that left them questioning who could be trusted. The city had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, and Foster was trapped in it, one wrong step away from losing everything. One afternoon, just as she was starting to piece things together, Foster received another message. It was simple, but chilling. "I'll be waiting." Tonight. Foster knew she had to face him. The time had come for the final confrontation. She had no choice but to go after him, to corner him and end this nightmare once and for all. That night, she and Daniels arrived at an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The place was dark, the windows boarded up, and a thick fog hung low over the ground, giving it an eerie, suffocating atmosphere. Every step they took echoed in the silence, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. They split up, both moving cautiously through the building, their footsteps muffled by the wet floor. Foster's grip tightened on her weapon, her senses alert for any sign of the killer. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The sound of a door creaking open sent a chill down her spine. She followed it, her heart in her throat. She rounded the corner of a rusted metal pillar and came face to face with him. The killer. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face partially obscured by shadows, but she could see his cold smile. It was the same smile that had haunted her since the beginning. "You took your time, detective," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable hint of amusement. "I thought you'd given up. But here you are." Foster didn't respond. She couldn't afford to show fear. She leveled her gun at him, her fingers steady on the trigger. Daniels was behind her, waiting for the signal. "You think you can stop me?" the killer taunted. "You think this ends with you?" In that moment, Foster realized the truth. This wasn't just a battle of wits. This wasn't a game. It was a war for survival. And in the end, there could be only one victor. Before she could react, the killer lunged at her. A blur of motion. Everything seemed to slow down as Foster's training kicked in. She fired. The bullet hit him square in the chest, but it wasn't enough. The man didn't fall. Instead, he reached for something hidden beneath his jacket, a detonator. Foster's heart stopped. "No," she shouted, but it was too late. The explosion was deafening. The warehouse shook, and debris rained down. Foster and Daniels were thrown to the ground by the blast, dazed but alive. As the dust settled, they looked around, only to find that the killer was gone. Vanished. For a moment, Foster thought it was over. But then, she saw it, on the far side of the room, where the killer had stood, there was a note, pinned to the wall with a knife. It read, "This game is far from over, detective." The case had taken an even darker turn, and now, more than ever, Foster knew that she had to find him. No matter what it took. The end of one game marked the beginning of another.